The front door was open 3 inches, not wide enough to mean welcome, not closed enough to mean gone. Gunnery Sergeant Nolan Briggs stood on the concrete step, with his right hand raised to knock on something that was already moving, his knuckles hovering in the cold morning air. And Kodiak had not moved 1 inch forward since the truck stopped at the curb. The German shepherd sat square on the frozen ground beside Nolan's left boot, broad chest level, ears at full attention, and every muscle across his back and shoulders had gone rigid in that particular way that was not aggression and not fear, but something more deliberate than either, recognition. Kodiak had smelled something, and he had decided Nolan needed to know before he went any further. The November morning was gray and still, and the maples along Decatur Street had already given up their leaves. The houses on this block were the kind that had stood since before World War II, close together and built with intention, solid brick and painted trim and small yards behind iron fences that people actually swept. Nolan had grown up 2 blocks over. He had ridden his bicycle past this house more times than he could count. He knew the man who lived inside it the way you know a person who was simply always there, reliable as the oak in the front yard, steady in the same way certain people are steady before you understand that steadiness is something earned and not given. Harold Voss had been 63 years old when Nolan shipped out the first time. That had been 11 years ago. If you are still watching this story, please take a moment to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and stay with us until the very end. Kodiak stood absolutely still. Nolan put his knuckles against the painted wood and knocked, and when nothing answered from inside, he took the door at its edge and pushed it open slowly and stepped in. The smell reached him before the light did. It was not the smell of anything dramatic or violent. It was the smell of a house that had closed itself off, of stale warmth and old food and something medicinal underneath that. A faint, sharp edge of over-the-counter painkiller and unwashed laundry. Nolan had smelled worse in worse places, but this smell in this house hit him differently because he knew what Harold Voss's house was supposed to smell like. Coffee and wood shavings and the particular mineral scent of machine oil, because Harold had kept a small workshop in the basement for as long as anyone could remember. The workshop smell was gone. The coffee smell was gone. What remained was the smell of someone managing alone and not managing well. Kodiak moved forward 1 step, slow and deliberate, and sat again just inside the door. The dog looked down the narrow hallway toward the kitchen, and then looked back at Nolan. That was all. Nolan called Harold's name. He heard it before he saw it, a low scraping sound from the kitchen. The particular sound of a chair being used as a walking aid, something that should not have been necessary for a man who had once built a 14-foot workbench by himself over a single weekend when Nolan was 11 years old, and had watched the whole operation with his mouth open. Harold Voss came around the kitchen doorframe, moving carefully, 1 hand on the wall, and Nolan looked at him and felt something that was not quite alarm and not quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. Harold was 74 now. He had always been a big man, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that suggested serious work done over a long time, a face that was weathered and calm and carried its years honestly. He was still big, but he had gone thin in a way that was not intentional, the kind of thin that happens when eating stops being a priority, and he moved with a careful hesitation around his right hip that Nolan had not seen in him before. His hair had gone fully white since Nolan had last been in this house, and his eyes, which had always been a particular sharp blue, were the same, looking at Nolan across the kitchen threshold with something that started as surprise and shifted, quickly and without drama, into relief. He said Nolan's name once. Nolan said hello. Then neither of them said anything for a moment, which was fine, because they were the kind of people for whom silence between them had always been comfortable, rather than empty. Nolan did not ask if Harold was all right. He could see that Harold was not all right, and asking the question would have forced Harold to either lie or acknowledge something he was not ready to acknowledge in front of a visitor, and Nolan did not want to do that to him. Instead, he said he had been through town and thought he would stop, and asked if there was coffee. Harold said the pot was on the stove. It was cold, and it had been sitting since morning, but Harold poured 2 cups without apologizing for it, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Kodiak came into the kitchen doorway and settled himself on the floor just inside it without being invited. Harold looked at the dog for a long moment. Then he said he had always liked German Shepherds. Nolan said Kodiak had always liked people who were worth liking, and left it at that. Harold's hand around his coffee cup, Nolan noticed, had a slight tremor in it that had not been there before. He said nothing about that either. They talked for an hour in the way that men of a certain age and certain history talk, which is to say they talked about other things entirely, while the real conversation ran underneath. Harold asked about the service. Nolan said he had separated in April. Harold nodded as though this confirmed something he had already guessed. Nolan asked about Harold's son, whose name was Dennis and who lived in Charlotte with his wife and their 3 children. Harold said Dennis was busy, which was a sentence that carried more weight than its 4 words could contain. He said it without bitterness, which was almost harder to hear than bitterness would have been. Nolan looked at the kitchen counter while Harold said it. There were 3 prescription bottles lined up beside the sink, and a notepad with a number written on it that looked like it had been written and rewritten several times, and beside the notepad was a manila envelope with the return address of a company called Halloran Property Services. And the envelope had been opened and then folded back into its original crease in the careful way that people handle paperwork they are trying to decide what to do with. Nolan looked away from the envelope. He looked at Kodiak. Kodiak was watching Harold with the settled, attentive stillness that the dog reserved for people he had already decided were not a threat, which in Kodiak's vocabulary was a kind of endorsement. Before Nolan left that morning, he asked if he could come back on Friday. Harold said he supposed that would be all right. Nolan said he would bring groceries. Harold started to refuse, and Nolan said it was no inconvenience, and Harold looked at him with those sharp blue eyes for a moment, and then said thank you, which was not something Harold Voss had ever said easily, and the weight of it settled in the kitchen the same way real things settle. Nolan picked up Kodiak's lead from the floor where it had coiled itself against the baseboards, and he walked to his truck in the gray morning and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. He was not in the habit of sentimental reflection. 11 years in the Marine Corps had organized him toward action rather than feeling, and the action available to him right now was small and concrete, and he would do it. He pulled out of the curb and drove, and the sealed November street moved past his windows, and he thought about the envelope on Harold Voss's counter and the number written and rewritten on the notepad beside it. That answer stayed in Nolan's head longer than he expected. Nolan came back Friday with 2 bags of groceries and a box of filters for the coffee maker, because he had noticed the box was empty. He also came back with his laptop in the front seat, though he did not bring it inside yet. Harold let him in, and they put the groceries away together in the unhurried way that 2 people work when they are not performing efficiency for anyone. The kitchen felt slightly less closed than it had on Tuesday, either because Harold had opened a window at some point, or because the presence of fresh food changed something about the air. Kodiak went directly to his spot in the kitchen doorway and lay down with his chin on his paws, watching Harold move between the counter and the refrigerator with the patient, evaluating calm of a dog who is making a longer-term decision about a person. When Harold set a bowl of water on the floor without being asked, Kodiak's tail moved once against the tile. Harold watched this and said nothing, but the expression that crossed his face was something private and careful. He put the bowl down in a deliberate place, not too close to the wall and not in the way of foot traffic, which meant he had thought about where it should go before he put it there. After the groceries were away, they sat again, and this time the coffee was fresh, and Harold set his cup down on the table with a steadiness that seemed to cost him something, and looked at Nolan directly and said there was a matter he had been trying to handle on his own and had not been doing a satisfactory job of handling. He said this with the same plainness and exactness that had always characterized the way Harold Voss communicated, which was the legacy of a man who had spent 31 years as a machinist and had learned to be precise in everything, because imprecision in his work cost money and sometimes cost fingers. Nolan said he was listening. Harold got up and went to the counter and came back with the manila envelope and laid it on the table between them. The return address read, Halloran Property Services, Suite 400, and the city was listed as Columbus. Harold sat back down and folded his hands together in his lap, and Nolan opened the envelope and read what was inside. The letter was 2 pages. It was written in the polished, over-organized language of people who have learned to say things in ways that are technically accurate and practically deceptive, full of phrases like accelerated line assessment and municipal code encumbrance review and pending structural compliance determination. Nolan had not been to law school, and he had not studied real estate, but he had spent 11 years reading orders and briefs and after-action reports, and he knew how language worked when it was being used to confuse rather than inform. He read through both pages slowly, and when he finished, he went back to the beginning and read them again. The core of what the letter was saying, stripped of its scaffolding of legal vocabulary, was this. Halloran Property Services had purchased a block of municipal debt that included code violation liens on a number of properties in the city, one of which was Harold Voss's house on Decatur Street. And unless Harold paid a sum of $22,000 within 60 days, Halloran Property Services would move to force a sheriff's sale of the property. The 60-day window had been triggered, according to the letter, 23 days ago. 37 days remained. Nolan read the 60-day figure twice to be sure he had it correctly. He set the letter on the table and looked at Harold and asked what the underlying violation was. Harold said it was a roof inspection that had been flagged 6 years ago and subsequently disputed and, he had believed, resolved. Nolan asked if he had documentation of the resolution. Harold said he had paperwork somewhere that he would need to find. The word somewhere was the most troubling word in the sentence. Nolan did not panic, and he did not perform reassurance he could not back up. He asked Harold's permission to look into it, which Harold granted with a brief nod. And he told Harold to find every piece of paper he had related to the roof and the lien and the dispute resolution, and that he would be back on Monday with someone who understood this better than he did. Harold looked at him for a moment and then said, "Your father would be glad you came back." He said it quietly and without theatrics, looking at the table rather than at Nolan, and Nolan looked away toward the window and felt something shift hard and sudden in his chest, a pressure that arrived without warning and took a moment to subside. He had not expected that. He had not been back in this city for more than a passing hour since his father's funeral 4 years ago. And he had told himself the not coming back was practical, not emotional. And Harold Voss, who was a precise man, had just indicated clearly and without cruelty that he was not fooled. Nolan said he would see Harold on Monday, He got up and picked up Kodiak's lead, and Kodiak rose from the kitchen floor and came to his left knee without prompting, and they went out into the November cold together. The woman Nolan called on Saturday was named Patricia Day. She was 41 years old, with close-cropped natural hair gone to silver at the temples, and the specific, settled energy of someone who had been competent for so long that competence had become invisible in her. She was a housing rights attorney who worked out of a 3-room office above a dry cleaner on Meredith Avenue, and Nolan had known her through his sister, who had gone to law school with her a decade ago and described her as the person you called when the paperwork was being used as a weapon. Nolan called Patricia on Saturday afternoon and explained the situation in the brief, factual way that he explained things, and Patricia was quiet for a moment on her end of the line, and then said she had been watching Halloran Property Services for 2 years and asked if she could see the letter. Nolan said he would bring it Monday morning. Patricia said she would clear her 9 o'clock. On his end of the call, Kodiak was lying beside the heating vent in the kitchen of the furnished room Nolan was renting, and the dog's ears moved at Patricia's voice through the phone speaker in a way that suggested he was listening to the conversation. Nolan trusted Kodiak's judgment in the general direction of people before he could form his own, and the dog's quiet attention felt like something provisional being extended. Sunday, Nolan drove to Harold's house and spent 4 hours in the basement, going through the workshop where Harold kept his files. The workshop was the saddest room in a house that had gotten sad, because it was a room that had obviously been the center of the place and had gone completely still. The workbench ran the full length of the south wall, 14 feet of solid walnut top, smooth from use, with the tools still racked above it in the same order they had always been in, a precision that Harold had never abandoned even when he was no longer using them. Dust had settled over everything in the light, fine way that means weeks rather than months, which meant Harold had not been down here recently, but had not been avoiding it for years either. The files were in a 4-drawer steel cabinet beside the stairs. Harold came to the top of the stairs once and asked if Nolan needed anything, and Nolan said no, and he heard Harold's slow steps move back toward the kitchen. Kodiak sat halfway down the stairs, neither in the basement nor at the top, stationed midway the way working dogs station themselves when they have decided that the most useful position is one from which both spaces are accessible. The file for the roof inspection was in the 2nd drawer, in a folder labeled with Harold's meticulous printing, and inside it was a letter from the city's Code Enforcement Office, dated 4 years ago, acknowledging receipt of the resolution documentation and confirming the lien had been cleared. The confirmation number was printed at the top. The date was 4 years and 2 months before Halloran Property Services had sent their demand letter. Nolan stood in the basement in the cool silence and looked at the confirmation number on the letter, and the thing that moved through him was not satisfaction, but a controlled, particular anger, the kind that does not express itself loudly because it has too much work to do. He photographed every document in the folder and emailed them to himself. Then he photographed them again to be certain. He took the original folder upstairs and laid it on the kitchen table and told Harold what he had found. Harold looked at the confirmation letter with the expression of a man who had known this document existed somewhere but had lost faith in his ability to advocate for himself with it, which was a specific kind of defeat that Nolan recognized and found harder to witness than most forms of distress. He said the confirmation letter made it clear the debt had been resolved. Harold said he had tried to explain that to the company, twice by phone and twice by mail. Nolan asked if he had kept records of those contacts. Harold said he had notes somewhere, but could not put his hands on them. Nolan said the documents he had found should be enough for Patricia Day to work with, and he would know more by Monday afternoon. Harold asked who Patricia Day was. Nolan told him. Harold was quiet for a moment and then said he could not take charity. Nolan said it was not charity and it was not free, it was advocacy, and that Patricia Day had a history with the company making this demand and a professional interest in the outcome, and that Harold did not need to feel beholden to anything except attending the meeting on Monday. Harold sat with this for a moment. Then he said that in 51 years of living in this house, he had never had a problem like this. Nolan said he understood, and he did, and he said it without making Harold feel naive for having expected basic institutional honesty. Some people had simply not had cause to discover how institutions behaved when profit and paperwork aligned against the unprepared. Kodiak moved from the kitchen doorway to Harold's side while they were talking and sat very close to Harold's right leg. Not pressing, but present, the dog's shoulder warm against the man's knee, and Harold's hand came down from the table and rested on the dog's head in a gesture so natural that it appeared to require no decision. The dog held still. Harold's hand stayed. Nolan watched this and looked away. Patricia Day's office smelled like real coffee and old paper and the specific productive disorder of someone who worked too much and organized in ways that made sense only to themselves. She was behind her desk when Nolan and Harold arrived on Monday at 9 o'clock, and she rose and shook Harold's hand first, which Nolan noted, and she gestured them into chairs and did not spend time on pleasantries because the situation did not have time for them. She had already reviewed the documents Nolan had sent. She laid them on the desk and pointed to the confirmation number on the city letter and said that this number was a full satisfaction record in the municipal database, which she had already pulled and confirmed, and that the lien Halloran Property Services was asserting had been legally extinguished 4 years and 2 months ago. She said this plainly and directly, the way a person states a fact rather than offers comfort. Harold's hands rested on his knees, and he was listening with the careful attention of a man who processes information methodically and will not ask a question until he has fully considered what he already knows. He asked Patricia if this meant what he thought it meant. She said it meant that Halloran Property Services had issued a demand for payment on a debt that no longer legally existed, and that this was not a paperwork error, it was a practice, and that she currently had 17 other clients in the same situation across the city who had received similar letters from the same company in the past 14 months. Harold sat quietly with this for a moment. Then he said, 17. Just the word. Patricia said yes. He asked how many of them had paid. She said 8. He looked at the table. He did not say anything further about those 8 people, but the quality of his silence said it. Kodiak was in the waiting area outside the office, and through the open door Nolan could see him sitting beside the receptionist's desk, with his ears forward and his posture attentive, not agitated, watching the small space as he always watched any space, cataloging it, settling it in his understanding. The receptionist had slid her chair sideways slightly to be nearer to him. That answer had been the same every time. Certain people simply drew the dog's goodwill, and it was not a performance, and it was not trainable. And Nolan had learned to read it as a reliable instrument long before he had any objective reason to do so. Patricia said she was filing an injunction that afternoon to halt any further action against Harold's property, and that she would be sending a formal complaint to the State Attorney General's office, which she had been building a case toward for the better part of a year. She said Harold's documentation was the clearest she had seen, with the most unambiguous paper trail, and that his willingness to be a named complainant in the broader filing would significantly strengthen the case. Harold asked what that meant in practical terms. She said it meant his name would be on a document that went to a government office, and that the outcome of that process was not guaranteed and would take time, but that the threat to his property was over regardless because the debt was not legally collectible. Harold said he would be a named complainant. He said it without hesitation. In the flat, precise way, he said things he had already decided, and Nolan felt something settle across the room when he said it, a small but complete thing. Patricia looked at Harold and said she was grateful. Harold said he had been in this house for 51 years, and he intended to be in it for whatever time remained, and that anyone who said otherwise needed to be corrected. Patricia said she agreed entirely. They were walking back to Nolan's truck in the gray November morning, Harold moving carefully on the uneven sidewalk, with Nolan half a step to his right, and Kodiak moving at Harold's left, close enough that his shoulder was within easy reach, and Harold said, without preamble, that he supposed the workshop could use some clearing out. He said it looking forward, not at Nolan, and Nolan said he had a free afternoon on Thursday if Harold wanted company. Harold said he would make coffee. Nolan said that would be fine. That hit him harder than he expected, because the offer was so simple, and so Harold, and because accepting it meant something, and both of them understood that without naming it. He was at the workshop Thursday afternoon and the following Thursday, and the one after that. The work was slow because Harold's hip limited what he could carry, and because the organization of the workshop beneath the dust was intricate and had its own logic, and Nolan found himself learning it rather than imposing his own, working within the system Harold had built over decades the same way you would work within an old house, respecting the bones of it. By the third Thursday, they had cleared the secondary workbench and sorted the hand tools, and Harold had begun giving Nolan small instruction. Not as a formal thing, but the way a craftsman instructs without deciding to, because the knowledge was continuous with the action and did not stay separate from it. Nolan's hands learned the weight and angle of Harold's planes and chisels and the system by which they were stored and returned, and this learning was slower and quieter than most of the things he had learned in his adult life, and that was fine. Kodiak slept at the base of the stairs on Thursday afternoons, with his chin on his front paws and one ear half raised, monitoring the sounds of the work below and the sounds of the house above, and finding both acceptable. They were 2 weeks into December when the man from Halloran Property Services came to the door. Nolan was in the basement when Harold's voice carried down the stairs, not alarmed but altered, and Kodiak stood from his place at the base of the stairs without Nolan saying anything, and moved up the stairs with a deliberate, unhurried authority, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. Nolan followed him up. The man at the front door was somewhere in his late 40s, with the kind of grooming that cost more money than it appeared to cost, a dark coat and a precise haircut, and the practiced composure of someone who had been in situations of pressure enough times to have developed a professional face for them. He was holding a clipboard, and he was speaking to Harold through the partially open door in the measured, over-polished tones that the letter had been written in, and Harold was standing in the doorway with one hand on the frame, not moving back, listening with the calibrated patience of a man who knows when he is being managed and declines to be. Kodiak came to Harold's side and stopped. He did not growl. He did not advance. He stood with his shoulder against Harold's knee and looked at the man with the clipboard with the particular stillness that was not calm, but was the thing underneath calm, the watchful assessment that preceded a conclusion. The man's eyes moved to the dog, and his practiced composure flickered, briefly and only once, and then he reset it. But Nolan had seen the flicker, and Kodiak had seen whatever prompted it, and both of them had registered the same thing at essentially the same moment. Nolan came to the door. He introduced himself by name and rank, which he had not done in months, and the rank settled into the exchange the way ranks settle, changing the geometry of it. The man from Halloran said his name was Spencer Reardon, and he was following up on a courtesy notice sent to the property. Nolan said he was aware of the notice and that Harold's attorney had already documented the lien's legal extinguishment with the Municipal Records Office and filed an injunction and a state-level complaint, and that Mr. Reardon was welcome to speak with Patricia Day directly, whose number Nolan could provide. Spencer Reardon's composed face moved through several adjustments in quick succession and arrived at a position that was no longer composed but was trying to appear so. He said he would need to verify that with his office. Nolan said that was a fine idea. Reardon looked at Harold once more, looked at Kodiak once more, and walked back to his car, which was a dark gray sedan parked on the opposite side of the street. Kodiak watched him all the way to the car and kept watching after the car had pulled away until the taillights disappeared at the corner, and only then did he turn back to Harold and press his nose once to the back of Harold's hand and move back inside. Harold looked at his hand for a moment. Then he stepped back into the house and closed the door. Spencer Reardon did not return. Halloran Property Services did not contact Harold Voss again. What Halloran Property Services did instead, in the following 2 months, was become very busy responding to the formal state inquiry that Patricia Day's complaint had initiated, and to the inquiries of 14 additional attorneys who had found their way to the case through the network that Patricia had been quietly building for a year. The specifics of that process were institutional and procedural, and moved at the pace that such processes move. But they moved, and they moved in a direction that was correct. Patricia kept Nolan informed. Nolan kept Harold informed, sitting at the kitchen table with fresh coffee, reading out the updates in plain language that stripped the process of its vocabulary, and gave Harold the facts of what was happening with the directness he had always preferred. Harold listened with his hands around his cup and asked precise questions and was satisfied with precise answers and did not require reassurance, which was consistent with everything he had ever been. The news of Harold's situation spread through the neighborhood in the organic, careful way news spreads in places where people have known each other long enough to understand when something is private and when it is shared. It was Louise Carver, 2 houses east, who first appeared at Harold's door with a pot of chicken soup on a gray December afternoon, saying she had made extra. She was 68 years old and had the direct, unhurried manner of a woman who had been managing things for a very long time and did not require ceremony for any of it. Harold let her in, and she set the pot on the stove and stayed for coffee, and by the time she left an hour later, something had shifted in the house's atmosphere that Nolan noticed when he arrived the following Thursday. There was a dish towel on the counter that had not been there before, a good one, the kind you are given rather than buy. There was a plant on the windowsill that was doing well. The kitchen table had a clear surface where it had previously accumulated mail, and the mail had been organized into a simple stack in the corner. Louise Carver had done none of this in a single visit, which meant she had been back. Over the following 2 weeks, the neighborhood collected itself around Harold in the particular quiet way that certain communities do, not as an organized effort, and not with any announcement, but through the accumulation of small, particular actions. A man named Robert Seal, who was 65 and had been Harold's neighbor across the back fence for 20 years, arrived one Saturday morning with his son and a ladder and cleared the gutters, which had not been cleared in 2 seasons. Louise brought groceries twice and stopped apologizing for the visits by the second time, which meant she was staying. A woman from the Methodist Church on Orchard, whose name was Vera, appeared with a casserole dish and a copy of a community resources pamphlet for seniors, and did not press the pamphlet, only set it on the table and said that some of the services were actually useful. Harold said he would look at it. He did look at it. He called one of the numbers on it on a Tuesday, which was the number for a home physical therapy service, because his hip had been the thing he had been managing alone and had said nothing about, and he did not offer this information freely. But Nolan knew it because Kodiak had known it from the beginning, the way the dog had known from the first visit that Harold Voss was carrying something that needed attention. Kodiak had adjusted his position beside Harold every Thursday in the basement workshop, always on Harold's right side, always close enough to be leaned against without making it obvious. And Harold had not said a word about the hip for 8 weeks, but had, slowly and without acknowledgement, begun to lean slightly toward the dog when he was standing still, and the dog had held that weight without moving. Patricia Day called Nolan on a Friday afternoon in late January. She said that the state attorney general's office had issued a cease and desist order to Halloran Property Services effective immediately, halting all collection actions on the disputed debt portfolio across the city. She said the case for the 8 people who had already paid was more complicated and would take additional time, but that the state had indicated a recovery mechanism was being established, and she had confidence in the outcome. She said Spencer Reardon had resigned from Halloran Property Services the previous week. She said this last piece of information without emphasis, as a fact and not a judgment, but the fact itself carried its own weight. Nolan thanked her. She said he was welcome and that he and the dog should stop by the office sometime, because her receptionist had asked about Kodiak 3 times and deserved a proper introduction. Nolan said he would arrange it. He sat in his truck in the parking lot of the hardware store, where he had stopped for weather stripping, and he looked at the phone in his hand for a moment, and then he called Harold. Harold answered on the 3rd ring. His voice on the phone was the same as it was in person, measured and without excess. Nolan told him what Patricia had said, briefly and in plain terms. The order was issued. The company could not pursue him or anyone else. The situation was resolved. Harold was quiet on his end for a long moment. Not a confused silence or an uncomprehending silence, but the silence of a man absorbing information he had not permitted himself to fully anticipate. He said, "Good." One word, with the particular weight that one-word responses carry when they have been earned. Then he asked if Nolan was coming Thursday. Nolan said yes. Harold said he had found a hand plane in the bottom of the 3rd drawer that needed reconditioning, and he thought it would be a worthwhile project. Nolan said that sounded right to him. Harold said he would see him Thursday then, and they ended the call, and Nolan sat in the parking lot for a moment longer, because the parking lot was quiet, and the day was cold and clear, and there was nothing else he needed to do right at that moment. And sitting with that was not a familiar feeling, but it was, he discovered, not an unwelcome one. He did not leave in January. He had been staying at the furnished room on a week-to-week basis, and it had been 3 months, and he found that he did not have the urgent readiness to be somewhere else that had characterized every extended stop he had made in the past 11 years. The furnished room was not a permanent arrangement, and he knew it. He began in the 2nd week of February to look at longer-term options with the matter-of-fact attention he gave to any logistical problem, treating it as a planning exercise rather than a decision about something larger, because calling it something larger would have required him to sit still inside the feeling of it, and he was not quite ready for that yet. Kodiak, who slept beside the heating vent and spent the Thursday afternoons in Harold's workshop and had allocated himself to the city in some working dog way that Nolan recognized and respected, was already settled. Louise Carver mentioned to Nolan one Thursday afternoon in the kitchen while Harold was in the workshop below, that the upstairs unit of the two-flat on Delwood Street, 4 blocks from Harold, had been sitting empty since August. She mentioned it in the way she mentioned things, directly and without performance, and then went back to cutting the bread she was cutting. Nolan said he would look into it. He did that same afternoon. And the rent was reasonable, and the building was solid, and the landlord was a retired schoolteacher named Mr. Greer, who asked 3 questions and offered the lease the following morning. Nolan signed it. He moved in on a Saturday in mid-February with the spare precision of a man who owned almost nothing and had been living from a truck, and Harold came with Louise and Robert Seale in Robert's car, and they stood in the empty front room with its cold floors and its good windows looking out on the bare February elms, and Harold looked around slowly and said it was a good space for a workbench. Nolan said he had been thinking the same thing. Harold looked at him, and there was something in his blue eyes that was not sentimentality and not approval exactly, but was in the family of both. The recognition that passes between people when the thing that needed to happen has happened, and both of them know it. Nolan looked back at him and said nothing, because nothing was the appropriate amount. Kodiak moved from the kitchen to the front room and lay down in the center of the floor and closed his eyes. The spring came in the slow, grudging way that springs come in that part of the country. A mud and gray process that took most of March and half of April before the yards on Decatur Street began to show green edges along their fences. Robert Seale and his son finished the gutters and started on the front porch railing, which had been Harold's project before the hip-made ladder work unreasonable. Harold watched from the front steps and gave instruction, and his instruction was specific and correct, and Robert Seale's son, who was 24 and worked in IT and had very little practical construction knowledge, listened to Harold with the attention of a young person discovering that a specific kind of knowledge exists in the world. Harold showed him how to read the pitch of a railing for water drainage and how to set the balusters at consistent intervals without measuring each one individually, and the young man's hands learned what they were being shown, and Harold's hands moved beside his, demonstrating without effort the 40 years of craft knowledge present in the motion, whether Harold was actively using it or not. Kodiak sat beside Harold on the front steps and watched the work with his ears forward and his posture content. Patricia Day's state complaint resulted in late April in a formal enforcement action against Halloran Property Services, with fines assessed and a court-supervised audit of their debt portfolio. The 8 residents who had paid the disputed debts were formally identified as creditors in the recovery proceeding, and the mechanism for restitution, while slow, was established and legally binding. This outcome was institutional and not dramatic, and arrived in the form of correspondence rather than spectacle, which was appropriate, because the resolution of real predation rarely looks the way stories make it look. It arrived as letters and legal filings and database entries and confirmation numbers, all of it particular and documented, and Harold Voss kept every piece of it in a new folder in the steel filing cabinet in the workshop, labeled in his precise printing, and he showed the folder to Nolan one Thursday afternoon without comment, and Nolan looked at it and said it was a good folder to have. Harold said it was the kind of folder you should not need. Nolan said that was true. Then Harold handed him the plane that had needed reconditioning and showed him where to start, and the work continued. On a Thursday afternoon in late May, with the windows of the workshop open for the first time to warm air and the smell of cut grass from Robert's yard next door, Harold stopped in the middle of explaining the correct angle for a smoothing pass and looked up from the bench and said, "Your father used to come down here on Saturdays, before he got sick. We would work for 3 or 4 hours and not say much. He said it looking at the plane in Nolan's hands, not at Nolan's face. Nolan held the plane and did not speak. Harold said, "He talked about you more than you probably know." Then he picked up a chisel and went back to work, and Nolan went back to work, and neither of them said anything further about it, and nothing further needed to be said. And the spring air moved through the open windows, and Kodiak's ears twitched once at a sound from the yard above, and then he settled again on the cool basement floor, the weight of him steady and quiet and entirely where he belonged. When they came upstairs an hour later, Louise Carver had let herself in with the key Harold had given her and was making coffee, and the kitchen smelled right, the way it was supposed to smell, and Harold sat at the table and looked at the light in the window, and his hands were still, and he did not appear to be managing anything alone anymore. Nolan pulled out a chair and sat across from him, and Kodiak moved to the kitchen doorway and lay down, and the afternoon settled around them all like something that had been waiting a long time to be allowed. If you have stayed with this story to the end, then you already know something true about what it means to show up for someone. When showing up is inconvenient, when you are not asked, when the cost is your own comfort and your own plans and the careful distance you have kept between yourself and the places where grief still lives. Harold Voss did not ask for help. He would have managed, in the way that certain people manage, quietly and alone, and at a cost to themselves that no one would ever see the full accounting of. What changed things was a door opened 3 inches on a November morning, and a dog who sat still on a frozen sidewalk and communicated, without language and without drama, that there was something here that deserved attention. Not every door that is opened slightly is an invitation. Sometimes it is only a request, unspoken, from someone who has forgotten how to ask. The dog knew before the man did, as dogs know such things, and the man trusted the dog, as men do when they have learned that certain knowledge comes from somewhere quieter than words. May you have people in your life who notice what you have not said. May you be the kind of person who walks through a door that is opened 3 inches and stays to put the coffee on. May God bless you, protect your family, and keep goodness close to you wherever you are.